silence can be louder than screams. In ancient China, emperors discovered that control didn't always come from the blade or the whip, but from the spaces where no one dared to speak. Imagine an empire of tens of millions, where villages bustled with labor, markets rang with trade, yet when it came to questioning power, an unnatural hush blanketed the land. This was not coincidence, it was design. The paradox of Chinese rule was simple yet devastating. The less an emperor spoke, the more powerful his words became. A single decree could reshape provinces, topple families, or erase entire traditions. Han Feizi, the ruthless legalist philosopher of the 3rd century BCE, warned that rulers must be opaque and silent, revealing nothing of their intentions. To show emotion was to give leverage. To remain silent was to become untouchable. The emperor's muteness was not weakness. It was strategy, a psychological shield that forced subjects to interpret silence as both mystery and menace. Silence radiated downward, seeping into every layer of society. Ministers debated in whispers, fearful that a careless phrase might be reported to the court. Families rehearsed self-censorship at dinner tables, teaching children that even truth could be dangerous. The absence of words became a presence, an invisible pressure that shaped thought before it ever reached the tongue. Modern psychology calls this anticipatory obedience. People censor themselves long before authority needs to intervene. In ancient China, this was not a rare occurrence. It was a way of life. Yet this quiet was not natural to human beings. In earlier centuries, scholars had argued openly in the courts of Zhou kings, clashing ideas like swords. That cacophony of voices once defined intellectual life. But under the weight of legalist doctrine, the chorus fell silent. What was once dialogue hardened into obedience. The transformation was so complete that silence itself became mistaken for harmony, a cultural inheritance that would echo for centuries. This was the first great trick of the emperors, turning the absence of words into a weapon more enduring than armies. Silence disciplined not only bodies but minds, and once the people learned to fear their own voices, the empire did not need chains to hold them. But silence wasn't natural, it was manufactured, and the emperors perfected it into an invisible cage. They say words can topple empires. Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, understood this better than anyone, and that is why he tried to erase them. In 213 BCE, he issued one of history's most infamous orders, the burning of books. Confucian texts, philosophical treatises, even records of rival states, all consigned to flames. But the fire wasn't really for parchment. It was for the human voice. By destroying words, Qin was teaching millions to fear speaking them. The decree was not about knowledge alone. It was about terror. The emperor commanded that scholars who resisted be buried alive, hundreds entombed beneath the earth in suffocating silence. Sima Qian, the great historian, later recorded that those who dared to speak of the past were executed. With every burial, a lesson echoed. Ideas were not dangerous because they opposed power, but because they existed at all. The hush that followed was not an accident of history. It was the deliberate architecture of fear. Before Qin's reign, China had been a cacophony of voices. The so-called 100 schools of thought thrived during the Warring States era. Confucians, Mohists, Taoists, legalists. They debated in courts and marketplaces, often directly challenging rulers with bold arguments. Words were weapons, but they were also shields, tools for accountability. When Qin consolidated power, that battlefield of ideas collapsed into a single, suffocating silence. The contrast was stark. What was once a chorus became a graveyard. Psychologists today call this fear conditioning, the process by which the human brain learns to associate certain actions with unbearable consequences. A child who hears of scholars buried alive does not need to see it with their own eyes. The story itself is enough to silence them. Entire generations grew up conditioned by absence, where even recalling an old poem felt like holding contraband. Language, once a bridge, became a trapdoor, and here lies the deeper paradox. Qin Shi Huang's empire was short-lived, collapsing just years after his death, yet the silence he engineered survived him. Later dynasties remembered his terror, not his words. Fear proved more enduring than any book. It left scars deeper than fire could burn. For when people are punished not only for speaking, but for remembering, the greatest censorship is not done by the ruler. It is done inside the subject's own mind. Thus the fear of words outlived Qin himself. What was once debate became hesitation. What was once speech became silence. The voice of the people did not vanish. It was buried alive, like the scholars who once carried it. And in its place, emperors found a tool more powerful than law, a population that would censor itself before a single decree was spoken. And yet, fear alone was never enough. The emperors found ways to make people silence themselves. Silence was not always born of fear. Sometimes it was dressed as virtue. In Confucian tradition, ritual, lie, was the heartbeat of social order. Every bow, every pause, every moment of stillness was meant to honor hierarchy. To speak out of turn during ceremony was not merely rude, it was sacrilege, and emperors knew this. They learned to weaponize silence, embedding it not only in politics, but in the rhythms of daily life. Imagine the Ming dynasty's imperial court. Before the sun of heaven, hundreds of officials assembled in their finest robes. The hall glittered with gold, jade, and lacquer, yet no one dared to speak. Hours passed in rigid stillness, the sound of rustling silk swallowed by the cavernous chamber. When at last an official was called upon, he advanced with measured steps, delivered his words in trembling monotone, and immediately withdrew. The silence was not absence, it was performance. A ritual designed to remind every man that his tongue was not his own, but the emperor's to permit or deny. Confucian scholars had long argued that silence reflected respect, the mark of a disciplined mind. But emperors twisted this ethic into obedience training. The philosopher Zunzi once wrote that rituals were the means by which rulers correct the hearts of the people. Under imperial rule, this correction was less moral than psychological. The silence of ceremonies trained citizens to associate stillness with safety, submission with survival. Like soldiers drilled into reflex, people learned to hold their tongues automatically, long before danger appeared. Modern psychology calls this operant conditioning, repeated behaviors reinforced by reward or punishment until they become instinct. In ritual, silence was rewarded with approval, with harmony, with safety from shame. Noise, dissent, or interruption brought scorn or worse. Over time, the lesson fused into culture. The quiet man was the virtuous one, the loyal one. In truth, he was simply the safest. The genius of ritual silence was its subtlety. Unlike executions or book burnings, it did not terrify in an instant. It shaped obedience drip by drip. Festivals, ceremonies, even family rites whispered the same lesson. Keep your voice low, your head bowed, your thoughts hidden. It was a softer form of control, but perhaps more enduring, for it convinced people that silence was not forced upon them. It was chosen, even noble. But beneath this veneer of harmony lay something darker. Silence ceased to be just an act of courtesy. It became a political instinct. The emperor's rituals were not simply displays of power. They were rehearsals for submission. And once silence became habitual, it no longer needed an emperor's order to sustain it. But silence in ritual soon became silence in politics, and that was far more dangerous. Power does not need to strike if it can stare. In imperial China, silence was sustained not only by rituals or fear of punishment, but by something more suffocating, the sense that the emperor was always watching. No cameras, no satellites, just the relentless shadow of surveillance cast across villages, courts, and palaces alike. People learned quickly that a careless word could travel faster than they could run. The Ming dynasty perfected this architecture of suspicion through the Eastern Depot, its notorious secret police. Disguised as servants, merchants, or scholars, these agents blended into society, reporting whispers back to the throne. A jest in a tavern, a sigh at a tax decree, even a private complaint could resurface in the interrogation chambers of the capital. Ming chroniclers noted that people feared their neighbors as much as they feared soldiers. Trust shrank. The empire became not a community but a maze of eyes. The brilliance and cruelty of this system was psychological. The emperor himself could not watch every subject. He didn't need to. By scattering spies among the people, he created a condition we now call the panopticon effect, the belief that you might always be observed, even when you are not. 2,000 years before Mitchell Foucault described the prison that controlled inmates through invisible watchmen, the emperors had already built one across their empire. The result was paranoia woven into daily life. Imagine standing in the bustling streets of Nanjing. Stalls selling spices, silks, and tea fill the air with scent and chatter. Yet beneath the noise lies a brittle caution. Traders smile but do not laugh too freely. Families talk but keep their voices low. At any moment, a stranger in plain clothes could be listening. Every face is a mask. Every word, a risk. What should have been the heartbeat of a city instead became a theater of restraint. This silent surveillance extended even into the emperor's court. Officials summoned to the palace would bow before the dragon throne, but many never saw the emperor directly. His presence was mediated through curtains, walls, and messengers, yet the weight of his gaze pressed on them as if he stood inches away. The emperor's absence became more terrifying than his presence, for when power hides, the mind fills the void with dread. Psychology reveals why this worked so effectively. Humans are wired to overestimate threats when outcomes are uncertain. A soldier on the street is frightening but visible. An unseen spy is unbearable because he could be anywhere. This uncertainty breeds anticipatory conformity. People regulate themselves not because they are told, but because they imagine the consequences of being seen. In this way, surveillance becomes self-surveillance. The emperor's gaze did not need eyes. It lived inside the minds of his subjects. And here lies the true genius of imperial control. It weaponized imagination. Every hushed voice, every cautious glance, every avoided phrase was proof that the emperor's presence extended beyond palaces and soldiers. It was atmospheric, like air that pressed against the lungs but could not be seen. The people carried their ruler in their minds, building invisible prisons more secure than any wall. The lesson was devastatingly simple. When people suspect they are always observed, they censor themselves more ruthlessly than any guard could. And once silence is self-imposed, rebellion no longer needs to be crushed. It extinguishes itself. And when people believe they are always being watched, they no longer need chains, they forge their own. Nothing teaches silence like the sound of a scream. In imperial China, the state made sure those screams were unforgettable. Executions were not hidden behind walls. They were paraded before the masses, ritualized, prolonged, transformed into living warnings. Punishment was never just about the condemned. It was about the thousands who watched and left with their throats dry, their words sealed shut. The most notorious of these punishments was lingchai, death by 1,000 cuts. Introduced in the Song dynasty and perfected under later emperors, it was as much theater as execution. The condemned was bound to a wooden frame, flesh carefully sliced in stages, each wound deliberate, each gasp magnified. The crowd was forced to bear witness to the disintegration of a human body, not in an instant but over hours. A man was reduced not by the sword's swiftness but by its patience. And in that patience lay the lesson: defiance would not only end you, it would erase you piece by piece. Chinese historian Timothy Brooke describes how lynchai was designed less to punish crime than to annihilate meaning. A man carved apart in public did not die as an individual. He became a symbol, a ghostly echo that haunted those who survived him. Parents whispered the tale to their children. Neighbors lowered their voices when recounting it. The body's agony was temporary, but the silence it produced in the minds of witnesses could last generations. Psychologists today would call this fear conditioning at its most brutal. A traumatic event paired with a social context burns itself into memory. The sight of flayed skin, the smell of blood in the air, the sobbing of a widow, these became triggers. Long after the execution ended, the memory resurfaced whenever someone considered raising their voice against authority. One man screamed, 10,000 mouths went mute. Nor was lynchai the only weapon. Mutilations, cutting off noses, branding faces, amputating feet, turned living bodies into walking billboards of imperial power. Exile to the frozen north or the deserts of the west was another form of silencing, erasing rebels from the heart of society. In each case, the punishment reached beyond the victim. It infected the community with dread. Yet fear has a flaw. Its fire blazes hot, but it burns out quickly. Even the most horrifying spectacle dulls in memory, just as scars fade on skin. Emperors knew this. They understood that the silence born of terror eventually weakens, replaced by whispers of defiance. And so they began to craft subtler, more enduring methods, ways of making silence not only remembered, but chosen. But emperors knew fear fades, so they devised subtler tricks to make silence permanent. Terror taught people what not to say. But emperors knew that silence held longer when it was sweetened. Alongside punishments that seared fear into memory came rewards that made obedience feel safe, even profitable. If the whip silenced rebellion, the promise of survival, or better, advancement, turned silence into ambition. The Han dynasty refined this strategy with its imperial examination system, the gateway to the bureaucracy. On paper, it tested knowledge of Confucian classics. In reality, it tested conformity. The brightest minds did not rise by challenging the system. They rose by repeating it flawlessly. Essays rewarded careful obedience to doctrine, not originality. A wrong word could cost a career, while silence in the right places could secure a lifetime of privilege. In this way, silence was not just survival, it was a ladder. Titles, land, or positions at court often flowed to those who demonstrated quiet loyalty. The man who did not complain about taxes, who bowed without hesitation, who memorized rather than questioned, could ascend. Even in villages, silence carried rewards. A farmer who kept his grievances hidden was less likely to attract the attention of officials. A family that remained quiet during political upheavals often lived to see the next dynasty. To survive was itself a reward. Psychologists call this operant conditioning. Behaviors reinforced by positive outcomes become habitual. Just as fear trained people to hold their tongues under threat, rewards trained them to choose silence even when safe. Over time, people stopped noticing the bargain they had made. Silence was no longer restraint. It was normalcy, even respectability. The obedient were praised as virtuous, the outspoken condemned as reckless. For the emperors, this balance of terror and reward was perfection. Silence became a reflex not born only of fear but of desire, desire for safety, for status, for the illusion of harmony. The empire did not merely crush voices, it enticed them into stillness. And so obedience spread, not as a wound but as a comfort. And yet, the greatest trick was neither punishment nor reward, it was turning silence into belief. The most effective form of silence is the one that feels righteous. By the time the Ming dynasty rose to power, emperors had discovered that fear and reward were not enough. Silence needed to be more than survival, it had to be virtue. And so they reframed obedience itself as morality, weaving Confucian ideals of harmony, loyalty, and filial piety into the fabric of political control. Confucius had taught that harmony was the foundation of society, that families and states alike flourished when voices blended instead of clashed. But where the sage imagined balance, emperors saw opportunity. They recast harmony not as dialogue, but as agreement. Silence in the face of authority was praised as the highest form of wisdom. To speak against the throne was not only dangerous, it was immoral. The Ming Emperor Yongle, who seized power in the early 15th century, perfected this propaganda. His court rituals and proclamations spoke endlessly of harmony. He presented himself as the cosmic center, the axis around which the empire's peace depended. To oppose him was to fracture not only the state but the natural order. The result was psychological brilliance. Dissenters were not merely rebels, they were disturbers of peace, breakers of virtue, betrayers of the family of China. Silence was no longer submission. It was framed as service to a greater good. Here, psychology offers a chilling insight. Modern researchers call this moral reframing, the process of recasting compliance as an ethical act. Once silence was equated with loyalty, people no longer thought of themselves as oppressed. They thought of themselves as good. A son who never challenged his father mirrored the subject who never challenged his emperor. In both cases, silence wore the mask of filial devotion. This inversion made obedience self-sustaining. To speak out was to court not only punishment but shame. To remain quiet was to align with cosmic virtue, to be admired, to belong. The line between genuine morality and political manipulation blurred until it vanished. What began as suppression transformed into identity. The empire no longer had to enforce silence with chains. It flowed from the conscience of its people. And this was the most unsettling revelation. Silence became a moral choice, a point of pride, a badge of virtue. The very thing that chained the people was celebrated as their highest value. The throne had not only commanded their words, it had colonized their souls. But harmony was only the mask. Underneath was the emperor's true weapon, invisibility. What is more terrifying, a ruler who shouts commands, or one who barely speaks at all? In imperial China, the most powerful emperors understood that absence could be more commanding than presence. By withdrawing from public life, by cultivating mystique, they transformed silence itself into an instrument of awe and fear. Unlike the kings of Europe, who often paraded through streets to show their power, Chinese emperors kept themselves hidden. Common subjects rarely saw the Son of Heaven. Many lived and died without glimpsing his face. When he did appear, it was shrouded in ceremony, veils, and distance. The result was paradoxical. The less he was seen, the more omnipresent he became. His silence filled the empire more effectively than his voice ever could. This aura was reinforced by the doctrine of the mandate of heaven. The emperor was not just a man but the cosmic mediator between earth and the divine. His silence suggested distance not only from his subjects, but from the realm of mortals altogether. When an emperor withheld words, it was not laziness. It was interpreted as alignment with heaven, as if his silence carried the weight of eternity. The less he spoke, the more his subjects projected meaning into his stillness. Historical accounts of the Ming dynasty highlight how this mystique was orchestrated. The Hongwu emperor, founder of the dynasty, cultivated an image of absolute authority by restricting court audiences and communicating through layers of officials. The emperor's words often arrived secondhand, transformed into edicts that felt less like speech and more like divine decree. The emperor's voice became myth, echoing through parchment rather than breath. Psychology offers a modern lens here. Social scientists have long observed the power of scarcity. The less accessible something is, the more valuable it becomes. By withholding himself, the emperor multiplied his symbolic power. Silence became scarcity. Scarcity became reverence. Foucault described centuries later how power works best when it is unseen, internalized, and self-sustaining. The Chinese emperors were already practicing this truth, their silence a mirror in which people saw whatever they most feared or desired. Imagine the effect on the imperial court. Ministers waiting days, sometimes weeks, for a reply to a petition. The delay itself was power. Each hour of silence forced them to question, had they angered the throne? Was their loyalty in doubt? No gesture, no look, no word, just the unbearable weight of not knowing. In the absence of speech, imagination filled the void with dread. Silence became the emperor's sharpest blade, cutting deeper than decrees ever could. Even rebellion was shaped by this mystique. When dynasties faltered, silence was interpreted not as weakness, but as a sign that heaven itself had withdrawn its favor. The throne's stillness became divine judgment. Silence, once a tool of obedience, now determined legitimacy itself. And here lies the chilling genius. The emperor did not need to command fear. He allowed others to build it for him. By speaking rarely, he forced every word to carry infinite weight. By appearing seldom, he allowed absence to multiply his presence. His silence was not emptiness. It was a canvas onto which the empire painted its obedience. And it is here we discover the most chilling truth. Silence wasn't just control, it was immortality. The emperors may be dust, their palaces reduced to ruins, but their silence still lingers. It is there in every society where voices lower when politics are discussed, in every nation where books vanish from shelves, in every workplace where truth is swallowed for fear of consequence. The silence once engineered by Chinese emperors has become a blueprint, replicated and modernized, stretching across centuries and borders. Today, the tools look different, but the principle is the same. Where Qin Shi Huang burned books, modern governments ban websites. Where the Ming secret police listened in taverns, digital surveillance listens in on social media feeds. Where rituals of silence once shaped the imperial court, now corporate scripts and political slogans remind citizens what is safe to say and what is not. The stage has shifted, but the psychology endures. People learn not only to fear punishment, but to edit themselves long before punishment arrives. Psychologists call this internalized control, the moment when authority no longer needs to coerce, because the subject polices themselves. It is the echo of the panopticon effect, the same mechanism emperors perfected centuries before. In China, in Rome, in Byzantium, rulers discovered that the most effective prison is not built of stone but of thought. And today, when people hesitate before posting a message, when they delete a sentence that feels too dangerous, they are inhabiting the same silence emperors once demanded. The unsettling truth is that silence does not vanish with dynasties. It seeps into culture, into memory, into the unspoken rules that define what can and cannot be said. In some societies, silence is still praised as harmony. In others, it is disguised as stability or respect. But beneath these masks, the structure is identical. Silence has always been a weapon, and it has always been celebrated as virtue by those who wield it. Yet recognizing this truth offers a different kind of power. If silence can be manufactured, it can also be broken. If emperors turned quiet obedience into a virtue, then voices raised in defiance can reclaim it as strength. The lesson of history is not only that silence endures, but that it can be unlearned. And so the question remains, haunting but necessary, when we speak today: are we truly free, or do we still carry the ancient silence within us? The emperors are long gone, but the silence they forged has never ended.